Hello everyone, Leaf Read here, and today we have a somewhat controversial book. We have White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo with its very kind of outstanding logo. You know, it really catches your eye when you walk by. So, funny story about this book. I was walking through the airport when I saw this, and I just thought, oh yeah, it's that book that everyone talks about. And it was a month later that my friend started like a study group, and he actually wanted us all to read it. And I don't like getting into what I would say contemporary arguments, talking points, political views, or anything. But he basically came to us and said, you know, we're going to read this. And he kind of came back after a week and said, you know, I find it very difficult to read. I don't really like it. It makes me feel bad. I'm not going to finish it. And for some reason, that just got me going, and it triggered me and said, well, you know what? This was your idea. You can't even finish the book. I'm going to do the whole thing, and I'm going to do a book report just for you because you said, oh, we're such we're such important people that we're going to learn from this. And honestly, there are some very interesting concepts in here that I did not think about. So Robin DiAngelo, she is a diversity trainer for companies and whatnot. And so a lot of this is the recollections of her own personal life, lessons learned, her interactions with other people. And so the whole novel, or the whole book rather, has a subjective stance to it. It's her kind of take on everything. And yeah. There are some really weird, interesting observations in here. Something like, you know, a lot of people consider Bob Marley to be black, even though he's a mixed person of white and black. And so she talks about the perception of race in a relative context. And she kind of says, you know, racism is very complex, but is also very simple. It seems to have a lot of conflicting ideas and precepts, you know, and so it's kind of written, you know, like that. So it's decently spaced out. And she talks a lot about hierarchies and racial hierarchies, how certain races are considered higher than others or lower than others, and how we need to disseminate and kind of get rid of that hierarchy. She also talks a lot about her one black colleague who says that, you know, when white people come to her to say, you know, we want to be less racist or get rid of our racism or to give us a pass, she says that's not the right focus that you want to take on. You know, it's not about getting rid of your racist feelings. It's about addressing it on an almost subconscious level, which is kind of interesting because if it's on a subconscious level, you're not aware that you're doing it. And so it's almost like, in a way, it's like original sin. Like, you know, the way that a man is attracted to a woman, you know, that's a subconscious thing that he can't control. And so, but it is conscious about what your actions are. And so I think it's about saying that, you know, how your actions are in the conscious mind are things that we can moderate and control, and we can focus on that. But she also says to focus on the subconscious as well. So here's like the opening introduction. I am a white woman. I am standing beside a black woman. We are facing a group of white people seated in front of us. We are in their workplace and have been hired by their employer to lead them in a dialogue about race. The room is filled with tension and charged with hostility. I have just presented a definition of racism that includes the acknowledgement that whites hold social and institutional power over people of color. A white man is pounding his fist on the table. As he pounds, he yells, "A white person can't get a job anymore." I look around the room and see 40 employees, 38 of whom are white. Why is this white man so angry? Why is he being so careless about the impact of his anger? Why doesn't he notice the effects this outburst is having on the few people of color in the room? Why are all the other white people either sitting in silent agreement with him or turning out? I have, after all, only articulated the definition of racism. So it seems like this is her interpretation of events, and yeah, the whole book is kind of written in this lecture kind of style, which I think is definitely off-putting for a lot of people. Okay, so here she actually discusses what is white fragility. The responses to our questions reinstate the white equilibrium as they repel the challenge, return to our racial comfort, and maintain our dominance within the racial hierarchy. I conceptualize this process as white fragility. Though white fragility is triggered by discomfort and anxiety, it is born of superiority and entitlement. White fragility is not weakness per se. In fact, it is a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage. Summarizing the familiar patterns of white people's responses to racial discomfort as white fragility has resonated for many people. So it's essentially the categorization of discussions about race, and that whites will not want to discuss it because they're fragile, but that fragility is actually not real, and it's a way for them to continue to abuse others through their fragility. And so this is the interesting part where she goes on to say that, race has always been part of the system of the United States government since its founding. And she says, while there is no biological race as we understand it, it's more of a social construct which has profound significance in the shapes of our everyday lives. So racism, at least defined by D'Angelo here, isn't something that is biological. It's not a biological white person or a biological black person or Asian and so forth, but it's actually a social construct that comes from the government, and that a country that is founded with this construct woven into its ideals and tenets persists into the present. And she says, no, I can go through graduate school. I graduated from law school. So this whole book is told from her perspective. Honestly, this whole book is kind of like her own personal diary, her own perspectives, and also giving a lecture from her perspective and her experiences on race. And it's basically, sadly, for better or for worse, she's basically saying you need to see it my way, or you're just basically uninformed and not thinking critically. For many white people, the mere title of this book will cause resistance because I am breaking a cardinal rule of individualism. I am generalizing. I am proceeding as if I could know anything about someone just because the person is white. Right now, you might be thinking of all the ways that you were different from other white people, and that if I just knew you, if I just knew how you had come to this country, or were close to these people, or grew up here, I would lay out my argument. It should be soon to make sense. So she's basically saying, kind of strangely, that, that she's going to brush all white people with the same stroke and the same opinion, as if that's not a racist gesture. The idea of race as a biological construct makes it easy to believe that many of the divisions we see in society are natural, but race, like gender, is socially constructed. So it's really interesting that basically, I guess it's a very nurturist standpoint that basically says, if we just envisioned different races as superior to other ones or all equal, then the divisions that we might see would just dissolve on a social framework. So if we saw, certain people who had different colored hair as superior to other ones, then suddenly society would start perceiving them as such. I guess she's trying to say that, we need other people to essentially change their minds about what is good and bad, or up and down and whatever, in order to begin to reorganize our values about other people and society in general. Yeah, and she says, Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, suggested that there were natural differences between races, that there was a biological reasoning for it, and asked scientists to find them. If science could prove that black people were naturally and inherently inferior, as indigenous people were also considered, there would be no contradiction between professed ideals and our actual practices. Of course, there was a huge economic interest in justifying enslavement and colonization. Race science was driven by these social and economic interests, which came to establish cultural norms and legal rulings that legitimized racism and the privileged status of those defined as white. So she's saying that ever since the beginning of the country, Thomas Jefferson essentially had to fund research to prove that other races were inferior. And the underlying claim of this book actually is that it doesn't have a solution for racism. It only assumes that racism exists and that we have to deal with it in some kind of capacity. Otherwise, it will just occur socially if not controlled, or if it's left alone. There are other, things in here. You have Jackie Robinson, one of the first colored baseball players. And she says that even though, it was the ideal of individualism that allowed him into the league because of his skill, she says this is actually a lie, because it was just a way for the racist institution of baseball to allow a black player to play to seem like it wasn't racist in order to defend its white power. And so it wasn't really based on that merit that they allowed him to play. The other thing about it too is that individualism itself and objectivity and responsibility are all things rooted in the Western culture, which are not things you may find in other cultures where people have, different races. And so to just simply by default assume that objectivity, individualism, and all these things are actually good or not racist is actually false, because it comes from that background. She also says things like, reverse racism can't exist because the oppressed are not able to oppress. The oppressed cannot oppress their oppressors. So it's not possible for reverse racism towards the ruling white class, in her terms, to ever occur, because they're the ones in power. There's also things, people bring up, what about Black History Month? That's a social, imperative for a specific group of people. And she says, Black History Month doesn't exist in a social context, so it doesn't really count. It's not part of the system that, because it's something that occurs naturally and doesn't come from the system. So that can't be a example of encouragement and non-racial discrimination. And she doesn't mention that because her background is Italian, someone brought up that, if you're Italian, there was a point in American history in the 40s and 50s when Italians were coming as immigrants into America, and they were considered non-whites, they were considered lower class, but today they're not. And so that perception of what was white and what wasn't, in fact, poor people, even if they were white, were considered not white at a certain point, changes over time. So the social structure, depending on who they decide is white, you might not actually look white, but you might actually have white privilege. So the idea is kind of that you might be Asian or Black or Native, and if you hold a position of power, you then actually become white in that context, because it's a social thing, not genetic. And the other underlying principle is that because all of these concepts of individualism and independence came from a European background, a singular racial background that isn't exactly compatible with other races, the idea is that, or the implication that I get is that, she says basically, if you replaced everyone in Congress with a different race of people, the system would still be racist, because you have normal racism, which happens socially, but all of that comes from systematic racism. And what is this? What is the system? It's the system of the government itself. So as long as the American government exists, and even if it's filled with people of all different races or a completely different race than the ones who started it, it still is using those tenets that came from Europe. And so therefore, the American system will always be racist, because that's how it was set up to be. I guess the implication, even though she doesn't say it in the book, is that if you actually want to get rid of racism, the only way to do that would be to overthrow the American government, I guess. That's basically what I'm reading here. Because otherwise, it's kind of like it's impossible to get out of it. It's like a system that is everywhere, and we don't even perceive it because it is so ubiquitous. So I guess either overthrow the United States government or create a new government that is created by a multiracial group, or a racial group that is different from the United States, I guess. Anyway, that's kind of the conclusion I eventually got to. There's a lot of things in this book that are, I would say, unusual, but it is interesting to read how Robin at least thinks how people should be lectured about race. That she said, for example, someone said, well, what about individualism? Why can't we just identify as the people we are rather than what we're made of? And her response to that is that, encouraging individualism is not helpful to understanding our social context, that we need to think of things in terms of groups and segments in order to really understand the social implications of things, because in society, it's the groups that prosper and benefit and are in a hierarchy of power over one another. So individualism in that context doesn't really matter. It doesn't factor in. And talks about segregation and how the white class basically is trying to control all the other classes and stay in power. Here's an interesting chart that she did right here, and it basically says racist equals bad. That's ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, mean-spirited, old, and southern, while not racist equals good, which is progressive, educated, open-minded, well-intentioned, young, and northern. While making racism bad seems like a positive change, we have to look at how this functions in practice. Within this paradigm, to suggest that I'm a racist is to deliver a deep moral blow, a kind of character assassination. Having received this blow, I must defend my character, and that is where all my energy will go, to deflecting the charge, rather than reflecting on my behavior in this way. The good-bad binary makes it nearly impossible to talk to white people about racism, what it is, how it shapes all of us, and the inevitable ways that we are conditioned to participate in it. If we cannot discuss these dynamics or see ourselves within them, we cannot stop participating in racism. The good-bad binary made it effectively impossible for the average white person to understand, much less interpret, racism. So even though we have this binary, it's not good to actually think of it as racism as bad and non-racism as good, because then people won't want to talk about it. The other thing that basically is the other conclusion is that if racism is basically treated like original sin, well, the biblical context to original sin is that you can't go to confession for original sin. You just have to deal with it. It's just part of our nature, that the way that women have pain during pregnancy, men have to toil and work the ground, and that's just simply in the Christian tradition, that's simply just part of our lives. So, the two conclusions that really I've gotten from this book are that, one, overthrow the American government, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon, at least. And true, you just have to be comfortable with being racist, because there's really no way out of it. It's basically stated that, if you have these friends, if you listen to this music, if you appreciate this culture, you're still going to be racist no matter what. And the only basic way to even say that racism is bad and non-racism is good exists in a binary where people won't want to talk about it. So the implication of that is, well, then it's actually okay to be racist, so that people do talk about it and talk about how we can begin to discuss the racial inequalities or the racial fabric of society. And to basically, in a traditional religious sense, to just accept the racism as original sin and just say, yes, I do perceive other races. I can see them. They do exist. And she's basically saying to do that is not bad, actually. And to just admit that, that is part of your subconscious. There's no shame in it. And basically by doing that, you kind of make yourself free. It's like, yeah, that is the way, things are. And you just kind of acknowledge and understand the state of things. And she makes a differentiation between like individual racism and systematic racism. We already talked about systematic. Individuals, when there's a singular person who goes out of their way to encourage racism. But again, you shouldn't think of racism in a negative term. Just because basically because the media has always spun the term racism as a negative thing, doesn't mean it really is actually negative. Racism just means an interaction between a person of a different race and another person of a different race. If two black people do something together, if two white people do something together, or et cetera and so on, those aren't racist actions. But as soon as it becomes, if a white person opens a door for a black person, if a black person thanks an Asian person, if an Asian person buys something from a black person, all of those scenarios are racist, even though they might be in a positive light. Because it's just the simple fact that, the races are interacting, and therefore that is inherently racist. But we're just so conditioned to making that negative association, which doesn't actually exist. Because again, it's a social construct. It doesn't have to be that way. If you are in a position of power, you are white, even though you are not biologically white. If you're mixed or Asian or whatever, and you have oppressive power in the society that the individualist and capitalist ideas that were instilled into America, if you follow those part of the system, that means you are white in that social context. And it's kind of good to talk about them, because then you realize, oh yeah, everything is racist when there are more than one race involved in something. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's kind of the main conclusion I got out of this. So you shouldn't feel bad if you are racist, basically, is what I'm understanding this book is saying. And also that the system that is around us, it exists, and you can like perceive it, essentially. Oh, she also has these little anecdotes about, she said one time she felt sad and disrupted was when she said, oh yeah, my hair is all thin and straight, unlike my coworker here who was a black woman, and her hair was more like a black woman's hair, and it had a different texture, and it wasn't, the same. And apparently her coworker said that she was very offended by that. They, said, oh, well, we're not the same. And that offended her, that, that she was comparing their hair together. And so she had to learn her own personal racism from that experience, that, oh yeah, that off the cuff joke or statement could cause possibly resentment and upset feelings between people. But it was turned out to be not a huge deal, and they were able to get over it because it's like, yeah, that's just the environment we live in. So it's interesting. It definitely defines that if you're in a position of power, you are white. But if you don't have power, it isn't clear as to what race or what race you are, what social race you are. It might be a socioeconomic factor. Maybe if you're middle class, you're Asian, and maybe if you're poor, you might be black. I don't know. But apparently, if you're high class, you are white. So that would make Obama white, probably 50 Cent. Jay-Z would definitely be white. He has tons of money. So it really sounds like it's coming about to really understanding racism and in the right context, and understanding it as socially rather than biologically, it's very difficult, I think, for people to think of people as a different race as it relates to their social structure. And it definitely makes sense why, these kind of discussions are difficult to have. There's a lot more, but I think we covered the main components. So this book really is an interesting take on the whole, racial debate, and it's been talked about in all kinds of talk shows and things. And it is really difficult to wrap your head around how biological race and social race are not the same thing, and how oppressive power functions as a system that is so, ubiquitous we can't see it. I think I covered most of the concepts in this book. I can't really recommend it though because of just how difficult it is to understand. Like, you really need to be able to decouple yourself if you have a white race, for example. And to kind of understand it in a totally new context is a totally different shift away from what we're used to understanding race as. It kind of flips the foundations right on their heads, and it's really difficult to understand it. I mean, it's not a terribly long book, but hey, it exists and you can read it. And anyway, guys, that's the book. Not much else to say. I think we covered the main concepts. Really a mind twister. But yeah, there it is. I might recommend it if you're into this stuff, but otherwise, I'd probably skip it. As always, keep reading, guys.